Okay, let's get right into it. We are holding up an X-ray today, looking at the invisible structure beneath the surface of our society.
Hmm.
Think of it as revealing the hidden skeleton, you know?
Yeah.
The hierarchy.
Yeah.
The core idea we're unpacking is caste, not just something from history books or other parts of the world, but the very infrastructure of our divisions.
Right. The architecture, as she calls it.
Exactly. The architecture of human hierarchy operating almost like a subconscious code in our lives.
That's exactly right. And our guide for this deep dive is Isabel Wilkerson's absolutely essential work, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent.
Such a powerful book.
It really is. Now, be prepared. This deep dive is going to be quite academic and detailed. We're really pulling apart the intricate analysis Wilkerson presents.
Good.
Our mission today is clear: to understand, through the lens of this specific text, what caste is, how it operates, and its profound consequences.
And we're sticking just to her analysis, right?
Purely to the ideas and examples she presents, yeah. Navigating some of the, politically charged discussions she includes by focusing solely on conveying her analysis, not endorsing viewpoints.
Got it.
We're here to understand the intellectual framework of this powerful book.
So lean in with us. While we're going into detail, we're aiming for that shortcut effect, finding the surprising facts and aha moments that make dense topics understandable quickly. And a key approach Wilkerson uses, one we'll explore, is her comparison of the U.S. system to those in India and Nazi Germany.
Which is controversial for some.
Right. She acknowledges that some scholars have resisted it, but she sees this comparison as crucial for revealing these underlying shared patterns of hierarchy.
Yes, and Wilkerson structures her book very logically. Starts with the foundations of caste, moves through its pillars and tentacles, and then examines its pervasive consequences.
And we'll follow that kind of path.
We'll follow a similar path, drawing directly from those sections. And one of the things that makes the book so impactful is how she grounds this complex analysis in, like personal anecdotes and historical events.
Yeah, those stories stick with you.
Definitely. We'll be sure to bring those specific examples from the text into our conversation.
All right, let's start at the beginning of Wilkerson's argument then. What exactly is caste, according to this book? Is it just another word for race?
That's a fundamental question the book addresses, like right away. Wilkerson defined caste as an artificial construction.
Artificial, okay.
Yeah, it's a fixed ranking system of human value, deeply embedded, and often based on ancestry and traits deemed immutable, things you can't change.
Like skin color or origin.
Exactly. But the critical point she makes is that these traits themselves, they're neutral until they are given life and death meaning within a hierarchy.
Oh.
The system relies on rigid boundaries, to keep ranked groups separate and sort of in their assigned places.
So it's a structure that uses these traits to create the hierarchy.
Precisely. And this is where the book distinguishes caste from race. It argues that race, as we understand it, is actually a much more recent phenomenon.
Really? More recent than caste?
Yeah, dating primarily to the transatlantic slave trade. Wilkerson describes race as a man-made invention, a concept with absolutely no basis in science or biology.
Right, I remember she mentioned Broca's attempts.
Exactly. She points to historical failures, like Paul Broca's attempt to create racial categories based on physical traits, and the simple fact that if you lined up all humans, you couldn't draw clear scientific lines between groups based on height or color. It just doesn't work.
So race was invented for the caste system in America.
That's what the book contends, yes. That race, particularly in America, was created to signify these profound and unbridgeable differences that could then justify the caste system already taking shape.
Wow.
Caste is the enduring architecture. Race is the primary, though not the only, tool used in the American version to sort people into ranks.
That distinction is powerful. Okay, so how did this architecture of caste get built in America, according to Wilkerson?
Well, the book traces it back to the early colonists. They initially tried to enslave Native Americans, but that was largely unsuccessful on their own land.
Right.
So this led them to import Africans. And by the late 1600s, Wilkerson notes, Africans were no longer just people in servitude. They were effectively hostages.
Hostages. That's a strong word.
It is, and she argues it's accurate, given they were subjected to documented, systematic torture by their captors. Slavery, in Wilkerson's analysis, fundamentally perverted the balance of power. It normalized the degradation and brutality inflicted upon the subordinate group.
She describes the sounds and tools.
Yes, very vividly.
Yeah.
The dragging chains, baying hounds, the report of pistols tracking runaways, and the instruments like mutilation and the branding iron. She calls the slave plantations forced labor camps, politely called plantations.
Forced labor camps, politely called plantations.
Yeah,
Yeah, that really strips away any romanticized notion.
Yeah, it does. And the book emphasizes the sheer duration of this system. It wasn't brief.
No.
Wilkerson notes a really sobering fact. The United States was it was a slave society for longer than it has not been.
Right. Say that again.
As of 2022, the U.S. had been an independent nation for the same amount of time that slavery lasted on its soil.
Wow. Okay.
And for African Americans collectively, they won't have experienced freedom for as long as they were enslaved until the year 2111.
2111. That puts it in perspective.
It really does. This history isn't distant, it's foundational. So even when slavery officially ended in 1865, the book argues that the structure of caste remained intact. It just hardened into the equally oppressive Jim Crow system.
And this is where the concept of whiteness emerges in the book, isn't it? How does that creation play into this foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. Wilkerson uses that unforgettable quote from James Baldwin. No one was white before he came to America.
Yeah.
She explains how diverse immigrants from Europe, Irish, Italians, Germans, people who might have been enemies back home, were fused together in America based almost solely on their appearance.
Why? Just to create a bigger dominant group.
Specifically, she argues, to solidify and strengthen the dominant caste against the burgeoning number of enslaved Africans. She quotes Lillian Smith's observation about the poor white's most precious possession being designated white.
What was the possession?
It acted as a charm against utter dissolution, conferring an immediate, categorically defined superiority simply by virtue of this new artificial identity.
Just by being lumped into white. Wow, okay. So the book shows us that caste is this deeper, older structure than race, using race as its primary brutal tool in America, built on the foundation of slavery and the strategic creation of whiteness.
You got it.
Now, the source describes pillars of caste that uphold this structure. Can we delve into some of those key pillars? Let's start with the idea of purity versus pollution.
Yes. This is what Wilkerson identifies as pillar number 4. At its heart, this pillar is built on the dominant caste belief in its own inherent purity.
And a fear of the opposite.
And a deep, often irrational, fear of pollution from the lower castes. The book gives us powerful, stark examples of how this fear manifested historically through extreme segregation.
Separate everything.
Everything. Think about the separation in virtually every aspect of life.
Yeah.
Hospitals, schools, she points out, separate textbooks. And in Florida, they weren't even allowed to be stored together.
Not even stored together. Good grief.
Water fountains, where black people sometimes had to drink from horse troughs, separate bed sheets in jails, explicit prohibitions against trying on clothes or shoes or hats in stores.
Couldn't even try on a hat.
Nope. And segregation even extended to ambulances, hearses, and cemeteries.
The sheer scale of that separation, designed to prevent pollution, is hard to grasp.
It is. And the specific anecdotes in the book make this pillar brutally clear. She recounts the infamous St. Louis Fairground Park pool incident in 1949.
What happened there?
When the pool was finally opened to black citizens, a mob of thousands formed, armed with knives, bricks, bats. They attacked black children, taunted them, chased black people away.
It's horrifying.
And the chilling detail Wilkerson includes is about a black child named Al. After white swimmers were removed for safety, Al was put in a rubber raft in the pool, and the lifeguard pushing him repeatedly warned, "Just don't touch the water."
Just don't touch the water.
Yeah.
Wow. That single command just encapsulates the raw fear of pollution this pillar represents.
Absolutely. And Wilkerson explores the psychological dimension, describing it as a kind of madness, an automatic revulsion some dominant caste members felt, needing to wash their hands after touching a black person, even if they were accustomed to their touch in roles of servitude, like as nannies or cooks.
So it wasn't logical, it was visceral.
Exactly. It shows how deeply the fear of pollution was ingrained, going way beyond simple physical separation.
Another pillar the book focuses on is occupational hierarchy. How does the caste system enforce specific roles and restrict opportunities?
This is pillar number 5. According to the book, caste functions by assigning people to fixed roles and occupations, often rigidly determined by their ascribed group, regardless of their individual capabilities or talents.
So your birth dictated your job, essentially.
Largely, yes. And it shut down ways to improve your lot. Wilkerson quotes historical sources saying every avenue for improvement was closed against him, speaking of the subordinate caste man.
What examples does the book provide to show this in action?
Well, the book mentions the menial and comic roles consistently assigned to Negroes, like in minstrelsy, which helped maintain the damaging stereotype of a simple, non-suffering people.
Right, justifying the system.
Exactly. Talks about the deliberate withholding of basic nutrients and food from enslaved people who were performing the most physically demanding labor. It highlights the brutal punishment for attempting to learn to read or write.
I remember reading about that.
She cites examples from the historical record of cutting off their tongue or by pouring molten lead into the ear.
Unbelievable cruelty.
And profoundly, she notes how subordinate caste individuals were punished simply for having natural human responses to the injustices they faced. Punished for grief, for anger, for
being human.
Punished for being the humans that they could not help but be, as she puts it.
That level of dehumanization is devastating.
It is. The book also includes the disturbing example of the Louisiana surgeon in the 1830s, J. Marion Sims.
Oh, the experiments.
Yes. He perfected surgical procedures like cesarean sections and the removal of ovaries or bladder stones by experimenting on enslaved women, often without anesthesia.
Because they were seen as property, less than human.
As Wilkerson states, he had unfettered access to the anatomy of live subjects because the caste system deemed these women disposable. His progress directly benefited white patients, built on suffering of black women.
And it seems this policing of roles and boundaries wasn't confined to formal occupations or structures. The book describes it extending to daily life, right?
Absolutely. The book emphasizes that caste involves the constant policing of roles expected based on looks and the meticulous monitoring of boundaries.
What does that look like in practice?
It takes various forms. Sometimes it's the dominant caste just disregarding the personal boundaries of subordinate individuals. Other times it's their intense efforts to construct and maintain physical and social boundaries. Wilkerson shares some powerful anecdotes here.
Like the architect.
Yeah, the 19th century black architect who trained himself to read blueprints upside down.
Why?
Solely to avoid making white clients uncomfortable by standing beside them to look at the plans together. He had to stand opposite them.
Reading blueprints upside down just to avoid triggering discomfort rooted in caste expectations. That's incredible.
It really is. And the frantic white mother in Mississippi who scrubbed her daughter's hand with a Brillo pad after she simply touched a black girl's hand.
With a Brillo pad?
Yes. It vividly illustrates the extreme, almost pathological measures taken to police perceived pollution and maintain physical separation.
And the bus ritual.
Oh, yes. The book also details the humiliating bus boarding ritual in the Jim Crow South. Black passengers had to pay at the front door, get off the bus, walk outside, and then re-enter through the back door.
Why? Just to humiliate them.
Explicitly designed, Wilkerson says, for maximum humiliation and stigma.
And Wilkerson brings this policing mechanism forward, noting its resurgence in more recent times, doesn't she?
She does, particularly highlighting examples that became prominent after the 2016 election. She discusses the rise of living while black incidents.
Right, people calling the police for just existing.
Exactly. Ordinary black citizens doing everyday things like sleeping in the dorm lobby, having a barbecue, babysitting white children had the police called on them. These incidents, she argues, show the ongoing policing of who belongs in certain spaces or roles based purely on their perceived caste status.
And she shares her own experiences, too.
Yes, she does. One was at a car rental agency in Detroit, where a man interrogated her, asking, "Why are you in Detroit? What are you here for?" Despite her being a well-known professional on business, just questioning her presence.
Because she didn't fit his expectation of who should be there?
Presumably. And another was an incident on a plane. She was in first class, had the highest loyalty status, but was still challenged about being there. Given cursory instructions, unlike other passengers, and later had her seat physically shoved by men nearby who were loudly talking about intrusions into first class.
Wow.
These personal stories underscore how the policing of who belongs where, based on appearance, is a lived reality, even for someone accomplished like her.
So beyond the outward rules and policing, what does Wilkerson's analysis tell us about the internal landscape of caste? The psychology it creates, the motivations. The book talks about inherent superiority and inferiority.
Yes. Chapter 20 in the book delves deeply into this. It explains how a caste system effectively centers the dominant caste as the sun. They become the standard, the default, against which all others are measured and inevitably found wanting.
Makes sense.
Wilkerson introduces the concept of group narcissism, drawing on the work of psychoanalyst Erich Fromm.
Group narcissism. What does that mean?
Fromm defined this as an overestimation of one's own position and the hate for all who differ. It leads to this profound distortion of thinking and judgment, where he and his are over-evaluated, everything outside is under-evaluated.
So it's a collective delusion?
Kind of, yeah, a collective delusion of superiority that twists reality. Wilkerson notes that Fromm saw this specific type of collective narcissism gripping both Hitler's Germany and the American South in 1964.
That's a chilling comparison.
It is. And Wilkerson shares her observations from her time in India, where she learned to discern caste not just by physical appearance, but by bearing and demeanor. She witnessed how dominant caste members naturally occupied the center of discussions. They led the conversation, while lower caste members often sat on the periphery, receiving admonishment without challenge. It illustrates how deeply these expected roles and the associated sense of inherent status are ingrained, how people carry it in their bodies.
And this plays out in subtle ways, too.
Definitely. She touches on the often subtle ways status is asserted in America, like emphasizing certain European origins over others, Irish versus Czech, Austrian versus Polish, using phrases like Heinz 57 to signal mixed but supposedly superior heritage, noting how historically a Nordic ideal often remained at the top of these perceived hierarchies, even among Europeans.
Scapegoating is another powerful concept the book explores in relation to caste.
Yes, Chapter 12 is dedicated entirely to this. The book argues that a crucial, often unwitting role performed by the lowest caste is that of scapegoat.
Taking the blame.
Exactly. They become the target for blame, diverting attention away from structural failures in society and absorbing responsibility for collective misfortunes. This dynamic serves to unify the favored castes and allows them to feel guiltless.
Like the original scapegoat ritual.
Precisely, mirroring the ancient Hebrew ritual of the goat, which carried the community's sins into the wilderness.
What examples does Wilkerson use to show the devastating real-world impact of this scapegoating?
Oh, she provides chilling examples. The story of Charles Stewart in Boston is particularly stark.
What happened there?
In 1989, Stewart shot himself and his pregnant wife, then falsely blamed a fictional black man with a raspy voice.
He blamed a black man?
Yes. This lie triggered an intense manhunt involving strip searches of hundreds of black men across Boston, calls for the death penalty against the man Stewart fabricated. All while the actual killer Stewart himself went unquestioned initially because his story fit the existing narrative.
That's awful.
Another example she gives is the Austin package bombings in 2018. After the first victim, who was African-American, died, the police initially focused their investigation on him, suggesting the bombing was drug-related or even self-inflicted.
They blamed the victim.
Initially, yes, before the actual bomber, who was white, was identified. The book also mentions the Ebola crisis in 2014 as a time when Asian Americans were unfairly scapegoated.
So this happens again and again.
Wilkerson notes that this dynamic often intensifies during times of economic stress, when the least secure members of the dominant group may lash out at minorities, blaming them for structural problems that actually affect everyone.
Those examples are heartbreaking and reveal the systemic injustice the scapegoating enables. Stepping back then, what does the book say are the broader costs and consequences of this caste system? Not just for the subordinate group, but for everyone in society.
Wilkerson dedicates significant space, including Chapter 29, to detailing these wide-ranging costs. For the subordinate caste, the burden is immense. They are constantly expected to adjust their behavior for the convenience of the dominant caste. They require a particular kind of wisdom just to navigate the system safely, day to day. And they're expected to offer one-way empathy.
One-way empathy, what's that?
It means they are pressured to forgive and understand the trespasses against them, sometimes horrific trespasses, without any expectation of real atonement or change from those who inflict the harm.
Can you give an example?
The book offers moving, difficult examples.
Yeah.
The brother of Botham Jean hugging Amber Geiger, his brother's killer, in court. The black bailiff stroking Geiger's hair. Or the Florida judge who sentenced a black juror to jail time for being tardy, while the white killer in a separate case received compassion and a lesser sentence. These moments are often framed as grace, but Wilkerson questions the expectation behind them.
The story of Devonte Hart really stuck with me from the book in this context. The photo.
Yes. Wilkerson discusses that widely circulated photo of Devonte Hart, the young black boy, hugging a white police officer during a protest, while many saw it as an act of black grace or reconciliation.
Yeah, that's how it was presented.
She powerfully argues it was actually the desperate gesture of an abused hostage. He and his siblings were later murdered by their white adoptive mothers, making a bid to be rescued.
Oh, God.
The tragedy was amplified, she writes, by the latitude granted these white saviors and the collective blindness to the depth of pain, visible in the boy's expression if you look closely.
That recontextualization is devastating.
And the book also connects the stress of navigating caste to a direct physical toll. She notes that African Americans, even those with higher education and income, experience lower life expectancy than their white counterparts.
Why?
She points to the out-of-place principle of social dominance, the constant vigilance required, and higher rates of hypertension among affluent African Americans, suggesting that the chronic effort required to exist and succeed within the constraints of caste extracts a measurable physical cost. Weathering, it's sometimes called.
It's a system that literally takes years off lives. Okay, what about the cost to the dominant caste, according to the book? Does it harm them, too?
Wilkerson argues that, yes, the dominant caste also bears a burden, though different. They face unsustainable expectations of superiority, which can be stressful in itself, and often a profound blindness to the ways the hand government has historically favored them and built their wealth and assets.
Like the New Deal exclusions.
Exactly. Pointing to examples like the deliberate exclusion of agricultural and domestic workers' fields dominated by black labor from many New Deal programs like Social Security and minimum wage initially.
So they don't see the systemic help they receive.
This lack of awareness, she suggests, leads them to perceive themselves as worse off when subordinate groups make gains, even small ones. It can lead to dominant caste members reporting experiencing more racism than African Americans in some studies, which seems counterintuitive but reflects that sense of status threat.
And unconscious bias plays a role.
She describes unconscious bias not just as individual prejudice, but as a mutation in the software of the caste system itself, affecting everyone within it. And she also makes a compelling link between the over-treatment and entitlement within the dominant caste and issues like the opioid crisis.
How so?
Suggesting that perhaps pain expressed by dominant group members was taken more seriously, leading to overprescription. She recounts the devastating story of the man who refused Obamacare, saying he'd rather die than have his taxes pay for Mexicans or welfare queens. And tragically, he did die from lack of health care he could have afforded under the ACA.
That story is a stark reminder of how deeply the system's divisions can harm everyone, even those it seems designed to benefit. And what does the book say is the cost to society as a whole?
The book contends that the caste system fundamentally drags down the United States in major indicators of quality of life compared to peer nations.
In what ways?
Wilkerson lists things like high healthcare spending for worse outcomes, a higher rate of public mass shootings, high infant mortality rates, especially for black infants, low scores in math and reading internationally, lagging far behind other developed nations and having a woman head of state, and a relatively low ranking in national happiness surveys.
So the divisions make us weaker.
They foster rivalry and distrust between groups, she argues, and a pervasive lack of empathy or sense of collective responsibility. This became painfully clear during the pandemic where, as one headline Wilkerson cites put it, as usual, Americans must go it alone. She traces the historical roots of American anti-statism and individualism in part back to the desire to maintain the hierarchies established during slavery.
So the divisions built by caste make us weaker as a society, less resilient, less connected.
Precisely. And the book highlights what Wilkerson sees as a resurgence of caste after the 2016 election. She links it to dominant group status threat, citing findings that concerns that minorities were taking jobs away from whites and that racial attitudes appear the more likely culprit for voting patterns than personal economic security for many white voters.
And specific tactics.
She discusses voter suppression tactics like purging tens of thousands of voters, implementing strict ID laws, closing polling stations predominantly in minority areas, as well as the continued, highly visible police shootings of unarmed African Americans.
And Confederate monuments.
Wilkerson describes Confederate monuments not as neutral historical markers, but as active political weapons, a form of psychic trolling, and a naked forewarning to the lowest caste of its subjugation.
Wow, psychic trolling.
Yeah. She contrasts this sharply with Germany's conscious lack of monuments celebrating the Nazi armed forces, a very different approach to difficult history. And she notes how the COVID-19 pandemic both exposed the deep disparities caused by caste and was exploited for scapegoating, particularly against Asian Americans early on.
It's a powerful, incredibly detailed analysis of how deeply embedded the system is and the extensive damage it inflicts across all levels of society. Given this comprehensive look at the problem, what pathways forward does Wilkerson's book suggest? What can be done?
Well, Wilkerson's work calls fundamentally for awareness and admission. That's the first step. She argues you simply cannot solve a problem you refuse to acknowledge exists.
Facing the truth?
Exactly. She mentioned the idea of a public accounting, suggesting something akin to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so that the full, unvarnished history of how caste shaped the nation is known by all Americans, not just some.
But that's difficult, right?
Extremely. She notes that in the U.S., the defensiveness about anti-Black sentiment makes these difficult truths literally unspeakable for many in the dominant caste, which prevents this necessary admission and reckoning.
And the book introduces a concept she calls radical empathy. That sounds like something more challenging than simply sympathizing or, walking in someone else's shoes.
It absolutely is. In Chapter 31, Wilkerson defines radical empathy and explicitly contrasts it with sympathy, which she describes as looking across with sorrow and pity, looking down with distant sadness.
So what is it?
She argues that merely trying to imagine how you would feel in someone else's situation, which she calls role-playing, is not enough. It often centers your own feelings.
Right.
Radical empathy, in her framework, requires putting in the work. It means educating yourself about the other person's history and context and actively listening with a humble heart to truly understand another person's experience from their perspective, not filtered through your own.
Listening to understand their pain as they perceive it?
Exactly. It's about building a kindred connection from a place of deep knowing that allows you to open your spirit to their pain as they perceive it. It is, she stresses, not about you and what you think you would or should do in their place.
That is indeed a much more active, self-directed, and humble form of empathy. It sounds like hard work.
It is hard work. Necessary work, she argues.
What is the ultimate vision the book offers for a world truly without caste? What could that look like?
In the epilogue, Wilkerson paints a picture of a world liberated from caste. Instead of what she calls a false swagger over our own tribe, that group narcissism we discussed earlier, she envisions looking upon all of humanity with wonderment at the vast, incredible array of capabilities the species possesses when not artificially constrained.
Wonderment. I like that.
She references diverse examples like the endurance of an Ethiopian runner, the focus of a young Swedish climate activist, the power of an African-American Olympian, the creativity of a composer rapping historical narratives, just showcasing the diverse genius of humanity when not confined by artificial ranks.
So it's about seeing potential everywhere.
And recognizing our responsibility. The book concludes with a call to recognize our responsibility for our own ignorance or wisdom and for the impact of our deeds in our own time, embracing the full potential of what our species could be if we move beyond these limiting structures.
Wow. This deep dive into Isabel Wilkerson's Caste has been incredibly illuminating and, very detailed. We've unpacked her powerful analysis of caste as this unseen, enduring system, its brutal historical foundation in America, the specific pillars and mechanisms that maintain it.
The psychological dynamics it creates.
Right, and its pervasive, often hidden cost to absolutely everyone in society.
Yes, and the core idea that Wilkerson brings to light, which we've really tried to draw out, is that this is not merely a historical concept or something foreign. It's deeply embedded in the very structure, the studs and joists of the United States.
Like the bones of the house.
Exactly. Understanding this underlying architecture as she lays it bare is, according to the book, absolutely essential for addressing the ruptures and damage it continues to cause.
And we've seen that the book points towards awareness, honest admission, and the challenging ongoing work of radical empathy as crucial pathways forward.
Exactly. And maybe here is a final provocative thought from the book's analysis for you, the listener, to consider. Wilkerson writes that knowledge is most valuable when it is understood and applied. Right. And that we are each responsible for our own level of ignorance or wisdom in our own time. She also observes repeatedly that the caste system extracts a significant cost, not only from those positioned at the bottom, but ultimately from everyone.
Yeah.
So if we accept the book's premise that caste is like a dormant pathogen, easily reactivated by extreme circumstances and still powerful beneath the surface, what is our individual and collective responsibility now having seen this X-ray of the house we all inhabit? What's our responsibility to prevent its spread and mutation in our own time?
How do we stop the unthinkable from staying normal?
Exactly. How do we ensure that what the system made thinkable and tragically normal doesn't continue to be so?
A powerful question to sit with and continue exploring. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to continue your own exploration of this vital topic.